If you see this horse, what immediately comes to your mind? For many, it is not just a wooden sculpture or an ancient symbol. It is a warning, a story of deception so legendary that it has echoed through thousands of years of human history. This is the Trojan horse, a symbol of strategy, betrayal, and the devastating end of a war that lasted a decade. But the story behind it is far greater than a single trick or a single night of destruction. Long before the horse stood at the gates of Troy, pride among the gods sparked a chain of events that would draw kings, warriors, and entire civilizations into one of the most famous conflicts ever told. Heroes would rise, empires would clash, cities would burn, and at the center of it all was a war fought not only with swords and shields, but with ambition, love, revenge, and fate. Tonight, we journey back more than 3,000 years to the legendary conflict known as the Trojan War. The story of the Trojan War begins not among kings, armies, or cities, but among the gods themselves. In the ancient imagination of the Greeks, the divine world was deeply intertwined with the human one. The gods possessed immense power, yet they shared many of the same emotions as mortals: pride, jealousy, rivalry, and desire. It was these very emotions that would spark a chain of events leading to one of the most legendary wars in history. The moment that set everything in motion occurred during a grand and joyous celebration, the wedding of the mortal hero Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis. The gathering was magnificent, attended by gods, goddesses, and divine beings from across the heavens. Music filled the air, laughter echoed through the halls, and for a moment the world of the gods seemed peaceful and harmonious. Yet one figure had been deliberately left uninvited. Eris, the goddess of discord and strife, was excluded from the celebration because the other gods feared that her presence would bring conflict to the joyous event. But exclusion did not quiet her anger, it only fueled it. Determined to disrupt the harmony of the gathering, Eris devised a simple but devastating act. Into the midst of the celebration, she cast a golden apple. Upon its shining surface were inscribed the words, "To the fairest." The apple landed among the assembled goddesses, instantly capturing their attention. What might have seemed like a harmless gift quickly became the center of a dangerous rivalry. The responsibility of judging the goddesses was placed upon a young prince of Troy named Paris. Though born into royalty as the son of the Trojan king Priam, Paris was not living within the grand walls of Troy at that time. Instead, he had been raised as a shepherd on the quiet slopes of Mount Ida. His life had been simple and far removed from royal politics or the affairs of the gods. Yet fate had chosen him for a decision that would change the course of history. The king of the gods, Zeus, had deliberately avoided judging the quarrel between the goddesses himself. Choosing one would risk the anger of the others, and even Zeus understood the dangers of divine rivalry. Instead, he ordered that a mortal judge the contest. Paris, known for his fairness and calm judgment among the shepherds, was selected for the task. The promise that Aphrodite made to Paris was unlike the offers of the other goddesses. Instead of kingdoms or military glory, she offered something far more personal: the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. That woman was Helen of Sparta, whose beauty had already become legendary across the ancient Greek world. Stories of her elegance and grace had traveled far beyond her homeland, and many believed that her beauty was so extraordinary that it could inspire admiration, envy, and even conflict among men. Helen lived in the powerful city of Sparta, ruled by her husband, Menelaus. Menelaus was a respected king, and their marriage symbolized not only a personal union, but also political stability and alliances among Greek kingdoms. Long before Helen married Menelaus, many kings and princes had sought her hand in marriage, hoping to win the affection of the woman widely considered the most beautiful in the world. Because so many powerful men desired Helen, her father feared that choosing one suitor might provoke anger among the others and lead to violence. To prevent this, all of Helen's suitors were asked to swear a solemn oath. They promised that whoever married Helen would have their protection, and if anyone ever tried to take her away, they would unite to defend her marriage. At the time, this seemed like a wise solution, but it would later become the very oath that drew Greece into war. Far away in Troy, Paris had already made his fateful decision by awarding the golden apple to Aphrodite. In return, the goddess promised that Helen would become his. Confident in Aphrodite's promise, and perhaps driven by curiosity and ambition, Paris eventually set out on a journey across the sea toward Sparta. When Paris arrived in Sparta, he was welcomed according to the customs of hospitality that were sacred in the ancient world. Menelaus received him as a guest in his palace, offering food, shelter, and protection. In those times, hospitality was a sacred duty, and violating it was considered a serious offense against both men and the gods. During his stay, Paris came face to face with Helen. Ancient accounts differ on what happened next. Some stories suggest that Aphrodite influenced Helen's feelings, causing her to fall in love with Paris. Other versions claim that Paris persuaded her with charm and promises of a new life far away from Sparta. There are also darker interpretations of the story. Some traditions describe the event as an abduction, suggesting that Helen was taken against her will when Paris departed Sparta. The truth may never be known, as the legend has been retold in many forms over thousands of years. What is certain is that Paris eventually left Sparta with Helen beside him. Whether through seduction or force, he took her aboard his ship and sailed back toward Troy. The act was more than a personal betrayal. It was a violation of hospitality, honor, and the sacred oath sworn by the kings of Greece. When Menelaus discovered that Helen was gone, his outrage was immediate. To him, this was not only the loss of his wife, but a deep insult to his authority and dignity as king. The event demanded justice, and Menelaus soon began calling upon the other Greek rulers to honor the oath they had once sworn. Thus, the departure of Paris and Helen from Sparta became the spark that ignited a war far greater than either of them could have imagined. What began as a promise from a goddess and a choice made by a single prince would soon escalate into a war that would draw together the greatest warriors of Greece and lead to the legendary destruction of the city of Troy. Years before the events that would ignite the Trojan War, a remarkable agreement had been made among the rulers of Greece. When the beautiful Helen of Sparta was still unmarried, countless kings and princes from across the Greek world traveled to seek her hand. Each suitor hoped to marry the woman whose beauty had become legendary. Yet with so many powerful men competing for the same bride, the situation threatened to turn dangerous. Rivalries could easily lead to violence, and the decision of whom Helen would marry could divide entire kingdoms. Concerned about the growing tension, Helen's father sought a solution that would prevent bloodshed among the suitors. A wise proposal was offered by the clever king Odysseus. Rather than allow jealousy and rivalry to erupt into conflict, he suggested that every suitor swear a solemn oath. This oath would bind them all to respect Helen's eventual marriage, no matter who was chosen as her husband. The agreement became known as the Oath of Tyndareus, named after Helen's father. Under this oath, every suitor promised not only to accept the chosen husband, but also to defend the marriage if anyone ever attempted to take Helen away. It was a powerful pledge, sworn by kings whose armies and influence stretched across the Greek world. At the time, the oath seemed like a wise way to preserve peace. Eventually, Helen chose to marry Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Menelaus was respected and powerful, and the marriage strengthened alliances among the Greek kingdoms. The other suitors honored the oath they had sworn, returning peacefully to their own lands. For a time, the matter seemed settled and stability returned. Years later, however, everything changed. The Trojan prince Paris arrived in Sparta as a guest of Menelaus. What followed would become one of the most famous and controversial events in ancient legend. Paris eventually departed Sparta with Helen beside him, sailing back to Troy. Whether Helen left willingly or was taken against her will has been debated for centuries, but to the Greeks, the act was a grave insult. When Menelaus discovered that Helen was gone, his anger was immediate and profound. The loss of his wife was not simply a personal tragedy, it was a violation of honor, hospitality, and royal dignity. In the ancient world, such an offense could not be ignored. To allow it to go unanswered would weaken his authority and reputation among other rulers. Menelaus soon remembered the oath that had been sworn years earlier. The kings of Greece had promised to defend Helen's marriage, and now that promise would be tested. Determined to reclaim his wife and restore his honor, Menelaus began calling upon those rulers to fulfill the pledge they had made. The call for support spread across the Greek world. One by one, kings and warriors answered the summons. Among them were some of the most famous heroes of Greek legend, men whose names would become inseparable from the coming war. At the center of this growing alliance stood Menelaus's powerful brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. Agamemnon possessed vast resources and military strength, making him the natural leader of the Greek coalition. Under his command, preparations for a massive expedition began. Across Greece, ships were constructed, armies were assembled, and warriors prepared for battle. What had begun as a broken promise and a stolen bride was now transforming into something far greater. The insult to Sparta had united the Greek kingdoms, and soon their combined forces would set sail for the distant city of Troy, beginning a war that would be remembered for generations. The call for war spread quickly across the Greek world, and the responsibility of leading the massive alliance fell to Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae. As the older brother of Menelaus, Agamemnon saw the insult against Sparta as not only a personal offense to his family, but also an attack on the honor of the Greek kingdoms. Determined to restore that honor, he accepted the role of commander of the united Greek forces. Agamemnon was one of the most influential rulers in the region. Mycenae, his kingdom, was wealthy, fortified, and strategically powerful. Its massive walls and thriving trade networks made it one of the dominant centers of power in the Greek world. Because of this influence, many other kings recognized Agamemnon as the natural leader of the campaign against Troy. Under his command, preparations for war began on an unprecedented scale. Messengers traveled from city to city, calling upon rulers who had once sworn the oath to defend Helen's marriage. One by one, kings and warriors answered the summons, bringing with them their armies, ships, and supplies. The gathering of forces was immense. Warriors came from famous Greek regions such as Sparta, Ithaca, Argos, and Thessaly. Each king commanded his own soldiers, yet all pledged their loyalty to the larger campaign led by Agamemnon. It was not simply a single army, but a coalition of many kingdoms united by a shared cause. Among those who joined the expedition were some of the most legendary heroes of Greek myth. The young and nearly unstoppable warrior Achilles arrived with his fierce band of soldiers known as the Myrmidons. His reputation alone inspired both fear and admiration among allies and enemies alike. Another important figure was the clever king Odysseus of Ithaca. Known for his intelligence and strategic thinking, Odysseus would later play a critical role in shaping the outcome of the war. While many heroes relied on strength and courage, Odysseus was valued for his sharp mind and ability to solve difficult problems. Other renowned warriors also joined the expedition, including powerful kings and experienced fighters from across the Greek world. Together, they formed an alliance unlike anything seen in the region's history. Each brought their own ships, soldiers, and resources to support the campaign. To transport such a vast army, hundreds of ships were prepared along the Greek coasts. These vessels would carry thousands of warriors across the Aegean Sea toward the distant city of Troy. The sight of the assembled fleet must have been extraordinary, with sails stretching across the horizon. As the preparations continued, the purpose of the expedition became clear. The Greeks were not simply planning a raid or a brief conflict. They were preparing for a full-scale war against one of the most powerful cities in the region. The mission was simple but daunting. Sail to Troy, reclaim Helen, and punish those responsible for the insult to Greece. With Agamemnon at the helm and a coalition of legendary heroes at his side, the Greek forces stood ready for the journey ahead. What they were assembling was more than an army. It was a force destined to become the centerpiece of one of the greatest conflicts ever told in myth and history. As preparations for the great expedition continued, warriors from across the Greek world began to gather under a single cause. Kingdoms that had once competed with one another now united in a shared mission to reclaim Helen of Sparta and punish the city that had taken her. From distant islands to powerful mainland cities, soldiers and kings prepared their ships, ready to sail toward the distant walls of Troy. This gathering of forces was unlike anything the Greek world had seen before. Each ruler brought his own army, weapons, and fleet of ships. Together they formed a coalition of powerful kingdoms bound by the oath they had sworn years earlier. Thousands of warriors assembled along the coasts, their armor gleaming under the sun as they prepared for a journey that many would never return from. Among these warriors stood one whose name would become legendary throughout history, Achilles. He was widely regarded as the greatest fighter among the Greeks, a warrior whose skill in battle seemed unmatched. From a young age, stories of his strength, speed, and fearlessness had spread throughout the land. Achilles was the son of the mortal hero Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis. Because of his divine lineage, many believed he possessed extraordinary abilities beyond those of ordinary men. His presence alone gave the Greek army confidence that victory might be possible against the formidable defenses of Troy. He did not come alone. Achilles commanded a loyal group of elite warriors known as the Myrmidons, soldiers renowned for their discipline and ferocity in battle. Wherever Achilles fought, the Myrmidons followed, forming one of the most feared units in the entire Greek army. Yet strength alone would not determine the outcome of the coming war. Among the assembled leaders was another figure whose abilities were very different but equally valuable, Odysseus, king of the island of Ithaca. Unlike Achilles, Odysseus was not known primarily for overwhelming strength or battlefield fury. Instead, Odysseus was admired for his intelligence and cunning. He possessed a sharp mind capable of solving problems that baffled others. While many warriors relied on brute force, Odysseus relied on strategy, patience, and careful planning. These qualities made him one of the most respected leaders in the Greek coalition. In times of uncertainty, it was often Odysseus who proposed clever solutions. His ability to think beyond the obvious would later prove essential during the long and difficult struggle against Troy. In fact, his most famous idea would eventually become the turning point of the entire war. Together, heroes like Achilles and Odysseus represented two different forms of power within the Greek army. Achilles embodied unstoppable strength and heroic courage, while Odysseus represented intelligence and strategic thinking. Both qualities would be necessary in the years ahead. As the warriors gathered and the fleet prepared to depart, the Greek forces were becoming more than just an army. They were a collection of legends in the making.
The harbors of Greece soon became a remarkable activity and anticipation unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. Hundreds of ships lined the shores, their wooden hulls creaking under the weight of supplies, armor, and soldiers. The air was filled with the scent of salt water, tar, and smoke from cooking fires as warriors prepared for the journey that would carry them into legend. This was not merely a mobilization of men and vessels. It was the gathering of a pan-Hellenic force united by a single, powerful purpose. Each ship represented a kingdom or city-state, carrying its own warriors, leaders, and families of soldiers who had joined the cause. The decks were crowded with soldiers polishing their armor, strapping on helmets, and sharpening swords and spears. Banners fluttered in the breeze, displaying the colors and symbols of their homelands, creating a vibrant mosaic of Greek unity. The sounds of hammers, ropes, and orders filled the air as the fleet prepared for the voyage across the Aegean Sea. Among the thousands of warriors assembling were the most legendary names of Greek legend: Heroes like Achilles and Odysseus ensured that their men were ready, leading by example. They trained their soldiers in formations, reviewed tactics, and instilled in them the knowledge that the coming war would test not only strength, but courage, loyalty, and endurance. The fleet itself was a marvel of ancient engineering. Each ship had been carefully constructed to carry both men and supplies for the long journey ahead. The vessels ranged in size, from small, fast ships capable of scouting and raiding to larger transports loaded with provisions, weapons, and animals. Together, they formed a flotilla that stretched as far as the eye could see, a moving armada poised for war. As the soldiers boarded their ships, there was a mixture of excitement and unease. Many of them had never traveled so far from home. For some, the journey was an opportunity for glory and fame, a chance to demonstrate their courage and earn a place in history. For others, there was fear, for they knew that war could bring injury, defeat, or death. Yet despite these fears, all were bound together by the same oath and the same mission. The purpose of this massive expedition was clear: to bring Helen home and punish the city that had taken her. Yet beyond this stated goal, there was also the desire for honor, reputation, and the maintenance of divine and human law. To let the insult to Sparta go unanswered would have been a disgrace, not only for Menelaus, but for all the kingdoms that had sworn the oath to protect Helen's marriage. The voyage across the Aegean Sea would not be easy. The sea could be unpredictable, with storms and currents threatening to scatter the fleet. Yet the Greeks were determined to face whatever dangers lay ahead, confident in their numbers, their skill, and the favor of the gods, though they would soon discover that divine favor was often as unpredictable as the sea itself. Leaders like Agamemnon took great care to organize the fleet, ensuring that the ships would travel in formations that could support one another in case of attack or accident. Scouts and lookouts were stationed to watch the horizon, while provisions and water supplies were carefully rationed. Discipline was essential, for any disorder could jeopardize the entire expedition before it even reached Troy. As the first sails caught the wind, the fleet began to move as a single majestic force across the sparkling waters. After a long and arduous journey across the Aegean Sea, the Greek fleet finally arrived off the shores of Troy. The sight that greeted the warriors was both magnificent and intimidating. From the deck of their ships, they could see the city rising above the horizon, its walls stretching high and formidable, a testament to the skill and determination of those who had built it. Troy was no ordinary city. It was a fortress, designed to withstand the assaults of armies and the passage of time. The city was ruled by King Priam, a wise and venerable monarch whose name inspired respect across the region. Priam had reigned for many decades, overseeing a prosperous and strategic city at the heart of trade routes connecting the Aegean and Anatolia. Under his leadership, Troy had grown wealthy, its people thriving behind the protection of the city's massive walls. The walls themselves were awe-inspiring, built with stone so solid that the strongest battering rams might fail against them. They were punctuated by towering gates and watchtowers. From the battlements, Trojan sentries could see for miles in every direction, scanning the horizon for approaching enemies. Every detail of the city's defenses spoke of preparation, vigilance, and the determination to resist any invader. Inside the walls, the citizens of Troy moved with purpose. Soldiers trained tirelessly, practicing with swords, spears, and shields.
archers readied their bows, while chariots were prepared for rapid deployment. Even in times of peace, the Trojans maintained a constant state of readiness, understanding that their city's wealth and beauty would always attract attention from ambitious invaders. As the Greek ships approached, the Trojans were quick to respond. Scouts atop the walls sounded the alarm, signaling to the city that a vast fleet had appeared on the horizon. The sight of hundreds of ships, each carrying seasoned warriors and legendary heroes, sent a ripple of tension through Troy. Yet the Trojans did not panic. They had confidence in their walls, their weapons, and the courage of their defenders. For the Greeks, the sight of Troy's fortifications was both inspiring and daunting. They had traveled thousands of miles, united under Agamemnon's leadership, and yet here was a city that would not easily yield. The gleaming walls and disciplined defenders reminded them that this would not be a simple conquest. They would need strategy, courage, and endurance to overcome the challenges ahead. Among the Greek commanders, opinions varied on how to proceed. Some favored immediate attack, eager to test their strength against the Trojans. Others, more cautious, recognized that a frontal assault against such formidable defenses could be disastrous. The tension among the Greek leaders reflected the seriousness of what lay ahead. Troy would not fall without a prolonged and bloody struggle. The Trojans, meanwhile, watched from their high vantage points with a mixture of determination and apprehension. Among them was Hector, the crown prince of Troy and its most skilled warrior. He moved swiftly along the walls, inspecting defenses and rallying soldiers. His presence bolstered the morale of the Trojans, signaling that their city would not surrender easily. As day turned to evening, both sides began to understand the scale of the conflict that was about to unfold. The Greeks had brought an unprecedented coalition of warriors, including heroes like Achilles and Odysseus, yet Troy was defended by generations of strategy, discipline, and fierce loyalty to their city. Both armies prepared mentally and physically, knowing that the coming days would test their limits. The Greek fleet remained anchored, and the soldiers waited, their anticipation growing. From the high walls, Troy's citizens kept watch, aware that the first clash would set the tone for what could become a 10-year struggle. In that tense moment, the stage was set. The forces of Greece and Troy were poised for a legendary conflict that would be remembered for millennia, a war that would test courage, loyalty, and fate itself. The Greeks demanded Helen's return, invoking oaths sworn and bonds broken. Envoys carried messages of reason and threats alike, their words polished but weighted with the gravity of impending conflict. They spoke of honor, of promises to preserve peace, and yet beneath their calm facade lay simmering fury. Each word was a delicate dance, an attempt to reclaim what they believed rightfully theirs without yet drawing swords. But the Trojans, proud and unyielding, listened with stiffened jaws, their own sense of honor guiding their refusal. In the heart of Troy, King Priam convened his council, the walls of the palace echoing with the tension of history in the making. Priam himself was a figure of dignity, yet aged and weary from years of rule. His advisors, generals, and nobles debated fiercely, weighing the peril of war against the inviolable choice to protect their city and their queen. The fate of thousands rested on their council, and yet there was no unanimous answer. Each voice, strong and insistent, mirrored the unyielding spirit of a city that had stood for generations. Word of the refusal spread quickly beyond the city gates, carried by messengers across the plains of Troy. The Greek forces, encamped by the sea, received the news like a spark tossed into dry tinder. Men who had trained, sailed, and marched under the banners of their kings now felt the surge of imminent battle, a mixture of excitement, fear, and grim determination. Among them, leaders such as Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Achilles strode the shorelines, contemplating strategies while their soldiers prepared to unleash years of anticipation and anger. Tensions flared in the cities of the Greek homeland, where families awaited news with bated breath. The call to arms rippled through villages and palaces alike, men leaving hearths and wives behind for an uncertain fate across the Aegean. Mothers clutched their children, soldiers embraced siblings for what might be the final time, and the air was thick with prayers to the gods for victory and safe return. Yet in every whispered hope lay the unspoken recognition that war was a cruel tide, indifferent to human wishes. The Trojans, for their part, fortified their walls and sharpened their weapons. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly, forging spears and shields, while farmers and artisans lent hands to strengthen barricades and towers. The city itself became a living fortress, its streets and temples echoing with the hum of preparation. Within the gates, women gathered provisions, children carried messages, and elders recited tales of past heroes, reminding all that Troy had survived before and might endure again. As the Greek ships lined the coast, their bronze prows catching the sunlight, a silence fell over the waters. The armies faced each other across the waves, aware that diplomacy had failed and that words could no longer bridge the chasm of pride and vengeance. The sea between them became a stage, shimmering with the tension of the moment, as if even nature paused to witness the collision of fates about to unfold. The first skirmishes were small but fierce, scouts and raiders testing defenses, sending messengers back with grim reports. Each clash, though minor, was a spark in the tinderbox, feeding anger and fear on both sides. From the battlements of Troy, archers loosed arrows, while Greek warriors learned the strength of Trojan resolve. The city seemed to thrum with the heartbeat of war, and each day that passed drew them closer to the full storm of battle. Legends of valor began to form even in these earliest moments. Names like Hector and Achilles were spoken with awe and dread, as each side saw in the other both enemy and mirror of their own courage. Strategies and counter-strategies developed, alliances were tested, and the gods themselves were called upon to sway fortune in favor of one side or another. Mortals, after all, could only do so much. Destiny and divine whim were ever present on the battlefield. The years stretched on, each day marked by a new challenge, a new loss, a new moment of glory. Families mourned, cities endured, and the endless cycle of siege and battle shaped men and women alike. What had begun as a dispute over a single woman, Helen, beautiful and fated, became a crucible in which heroes were forged, reputations immortalized, and empires tested. The story of Troy and Greece became larger than life, a narrative carved into the collective memory of generations to come. Finally, after a decade of bloodshed, cunning, and endurance, the war that had begun over pride and passion reached its conclusion. The tale of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy echoed through the ages, a reminder of the cost of hubris and the fragile threads that bind honor, love, and power. Troy had fallen,
but its story, etched in marble, song, and memory, endured forever, a testament to the enduring human spirit and the inexorable march of history.
Despite the ferocity of the fighting, neither side could claim a decisive victory. Each day brought the clang of swords, the thunder of hooves, and the piercing cry of archers' arrows, yet the walls of Troy held steadfast. The city's massive fortifications, built by generations of skilled craftsmen, proved as formidable as its warriors, who defended every tower and gate with unyielding resolve. Each assault by the Greeks was met with fierce resistance, and each counterattack by the Trojans was met with equal determination, creating a deadly balance that neither side could tip. Outside the walls, the plains became a stage for constant raids and skirmishes. Small bands of warriors darted through the fields, seeking supplies, scouting positions, and testing the enemy's defenses. Ambushes were laid in secret, and the sounds of battle could erupt anywhere without warning. Yet every raid, no matter how daring, ended with bloodshed on both sides, and no permanent advantage was ever gained. The war became a brutal chess match, where each move was calculated and each setback painfully endured. The larger battles, when they came, shook the land with their intensity. Thousands of soldiers clashed in open fields, spears shattering shields, and swords glinting under the sun. The ground ran red with the blood of the fallen, and cries of triumph were quickly drowned by cries of grief. Heroes rose and fell with equal swiftness, their names whispered across both camps, some with reverence, others with fear. Each encounter left both armies battered but unbroken, demonstrating that endurance and courage mattered as much as strategy. The larger leaders, despite their combined experience, found themselves frustrated by the resilience of Troy. Agamemnon's commands were met with stubborn opposition, and even the mightiest warriors, like Achilles, could not bring the city to its knees. Plans were drawn, feints executed, and traps laid, yet every tactic met with fierce countermeasures. The Greeks learned that raw strength alone could not overcome the cunning, preparation, and determination of the Trojan defenders. Within Troy, life carried on under the shadow of siege. Citizens of all ages participated in the city's defense, carrying water, tending to the wounded, and reinforcing weakened structures. Children were taught to hide or assist with small tasks, while elders shared stories of past victories to inspire hope. The city's resilience became legendary in its own right. Troy was not merely a fortress, but a living, breathing symbol of steadfastness in the face of relentless pressure. Even in moments of apparent calm, tension filled the air. Scouts reported enemy movements, fires lit warning signals across the battlements, and soldiers rested only lightly, ever alert to the possibility of surprise attacks. Every day was a test of patience and nerves, as both sides sought to exploit even the smallest opportunity. Yet as often as they struck, they were met with resistance, a reminder that victory in this war was measured not in days, but in persistence and endurance. The war also bred cunning and trickery. Deception became as important as valor, with spies infiltrating camps, messages intercepted, and plans deliberately leaked to mislead the enemy. Battles were preceded by feints and misdirections, ambushes concealed in seemingly empty valleys, and the careful positioning of forces to lure opponents into traps. Each clever maneuver was met with counter-strategies, ensuring that progress came only in small, costly increments. Amidst the chaos, the gods were believed to watch and intervene, favoring one hero or punishing another. Warriors whispered prayers, leaving offerings at makeshift altars before battle,
hoping for divine favor in a war where human effort alone seemed insufficient. The presence of divine influence, real or imagined, heightened the stakes, for every arrow that struck, every wall that held, was thought to carry the weight of destiny itself. The toll of the fighting was immense. Fields were trampled, crops destroyed, and countless lives lost in the endless cycle of attack and counterattack. Yet the spirit of both sides remained unbroken. Soldiers hardened by experience adapted to the rigors of siege and open battle, while commanders learned to anticipate every possibility. The war became not only a test of strength, but a trial of endurance, strategy, and resilience. And so the conflict dragged on, a relentless stalemate where bravery and sacrifice defined every day. Troy's walls remained unconquered, a beacon of resistance and the symbol of human tenacity, while the Greeks, despite their skill and numbers, were forced to contend with a city that refused to fall. The struggle continued, shaping heroes and legends alike, and etching into memory the truth that some battles are fought not for immediate victory, but for honor, survival, and the enduring tale of courage against overwhelming odds.
Leading the Trojan defense was Hector, the noble son of King Priam, whose presence inspired both fear and hope on the battlefield. Unlike many warriors who sought personal glory, Hector carried the weight of Troy upon his shoulders. His every decision, every swing of his sword was guided by the knowledge that the lives of countless citizens depended on him. To the Trojans, he was more than a prince or a soldier. He was the embodiment of their courage and resilience, a living symbol that the city would not fall quietly. Hector's motivation was deeply personal. He fought not for riches, accolades, or the songs of bards, but to protect his homeland and the people he loved. He knew the faces behind every door and the names of every child playing in the streets. Every wall he defended and every enemy he repelled was a promise kept to his family, his neighbors, and the generations of Trojans who had built the city's legacy. This devotion made him fierce, unrelenting, and deeply human, a hero whose strength was inseparable from his love. Each morning, Hector would stand atop the city walls, surveying the Greek encampments with a steady gaze. He observed their movements, studied their strategies, and anticipated their attacks with the precision of a master tactician. He trained his men rigorously, not to seek glory in battle, but to ensure their survival. Under his command, Trojan soldiers learned to fight not only with weapons, but with unity, strategy, and a steadfast will that no brute force could easily break. Yet Hector was more than a commander. He was a symbol of hope. Whenever the people of Troy felt despair creeping in, they would see him stride through the city, armor glinting in the sun, speaking words of encouragement and distributing reinforcements where needed most. His presence reminded them that they were not helpless, that the walls could hold, and that courage could defy even the mightiest enemies. Children would whisper his name, mothers would pray for him, and soldiers would fight harder when his voice echoed above the clash of swords. In battle, Hector's skill was unmatched. He moved with a grace and precision that belied the weight of his armor, striking with deadly efficiency, while always mindful of the lives around him. He protected weaker soldiers, intercepted attacks aimed at the vulnerable, and coordinated counterattacks that turned the tide of skirmishes. Yet even as he wielded fearsome power, he never lost his sense of humanity. He mourned the fallen, encouraged the wounded, and honored those who fought bravely, friend or foe. Hector's greatest strength, however, lay in his understanding of the stakes beyond the battlefield.
He knew that Troy was more than a city of stone. It was a home, a family, and a future. Every decision he made weighed the immediate demands of combat against the long-term survival of his people. He could not afford recklessness, for each life lost weakened the city's ability to withstand the Greeks' relentless pressure. This awareness made him a leader of both heart and mind, combining compassion with strategic brilliance. Even in moments of solitude, Hector carried the burden of Troy in his thoughts. He would walk along the quiet streets at dusk, listening to the laughter of children and the murmurs of families, imagining the consequences of defeat. He prayed silently to the gods, not for personal honor, but for protection, for strength to endure, and for the safety of those who could not defend themselves. These private moments revealed the depth of his courage. True bravery, he understood, was not in seeking glory, but in standing firm when all else seemed lost. The Greek armies knew of Hector's reputation, and their greatest warriors often measured themselves against him. He became a figure of both admiration and fear, the man whose spear could turn the tide of battle and whose strategy thwarted even the boldest attacks. Yet Hector never allowed their recognition to inflate his pride. He remained devoted to his duty, remembering that his life and his reputation were secondary to the survival of Troy.
Among the Greeks, Achilles became a figure of fear and legend, a name that struck terror into the hearts of all who heard it. From the moment he entered the battlefield, the air seemed to shift, charged with a mixture of awe and dread. Warriors whispered his name in hushed tones, not only because of his unparalleled skill, but because of the sheer inevitability with which he could bring death and chaos to his enemies. He was more than a soldier. He was a force of nature, a living storm unleashed wherever the Greek armies advanced. Achilles' prowess with weapons was unmatched. With spear or sword in hand, he moved with the grace of a panther and the precision of a master strategist. Each strike was calculated, yet executed with blinding speed, cutting through shields and armor alike. Trojan warriors, even the bravest among them, often found themselves overwhelmed before they could fully react. Entire units would falter at the mere sight of his approach, for they knew resistance against him often meant certain death. Yet it was not only his skill that made Achilles legendary, it was his presence. He carried an aura of invincibility, a confidence so absolute that it unnerved both allies and enemies. The Greek soldiers drew courage from his leadership, inspired by the certainty that Achilles could turn the tide of any battle. In contrast, Trojan eyes would widen in fear at the flash of his armor, the glint of his spear, and the certainty that no wall, no formation could fully contain his wrath. Many Trojan warriors fell before him, some in desperate acts of courage, others caught unprepared by his swiftness. Tales of his feats spread quickly, becoming stories of caution and horror across the plains of Troy. His reputation grew with each encounter, a warrior whose skill bordered on the superhuman, whose anger could consume even the strongest of defenses. For the Trojans, fighting Achilles became not just a battle of strength, but a psychological trial, a confrontation with a man who embodied their deepest fears. Despite his fearsome reputation, Achilles was not driven by duty alone. He sought glory and immortality
through deeds that would echo in song and story long after the war ended. Each victory on the battlefield, each fallen enemy, was a step toward eternal fame. Yet beneath the veneer of arrogance, there was a man acutely aware of his mortality. A warrior's brilliance in combat was matched only by the knowledge that death could come for him as swiftly as it did for any other. Achilles' influence extended beyond individual combat. His very movements shaped the flow of battle, drawing Trojan forces to meet him and leaving openings for Greek allies to exploit. Generals relied on his strength not only as a weapon, but as a strategic tool, knowing that where Achilles fought, victory, or at least survival, was more likely. He became both shield and spear of the Greek army, a central figure around which plans and tactics revolved. Yet Achilles' legend was complicated by his temperament. Known for both his ferocity and his pride, he could swing between restraint and rage in an instant. Moments of hesitation or insult could ignite his fury, making him unpredictable even to his own allies. This volatility added to the fear he inspired. An enemy never knew whether they faced a calculating warrior or an unstoppable storm of wrath, and both were equally deadly. The Greek camp buzzed with stories of his feats, and songs began to circulate even before the war concluded. Soldiers recounted battles where Achilles had shattered formations single-handedly, where his arrows and spear had cut down leaders and champions alike. The tales were both warnings and inspirations, shaping the morale of the Greeks and intimidating the Trojans. With every story, the aura of Achilles grew, transforming him from mortal warrior into near mythical figure. Despite the chaos he wrought on the battlefield, Achilles was not unfeeling. He mourned fallen comrades, and the depth of his bonds with those close to him, like Patroclus, revealed a human side beneath the godlike veneer. His anger and sorrow could drive him to acts of terrifying vengeance, further fueling his legend. The Trojans learned that facing Achilles was not merely a test of skill, but also of fate, for his wrath was swift and uncompromising. In the end, Achilles' presence defined the course of the war as much as the strategies of kings. He became the embodiment of Greek might and the living terror of Troy, a warrior whose name alone could inspire both hope and fear. His deeds, both celebrated and feared, shaped the memory of the Trojan War for generations to come, ensuring that the stories of his skill, his fury, and his humanity would never fade.
Tensions simmered like a storm in the Greek camp, where pride and ambition often clashed as fiercely as swords on the battlefield. Among the generals, Agamemnon, the king of men, wielded authority with absolute certainty, expecting obedience and respect from all who served under him. Yet even kings could misstep, and in his pride, Agamemnon insulted Achilles, the army's most formidable warrior. What seemed a small act, a dispute over a war prize, ignited a fire that would reshape the course of the war. The prize in question, a beautiful maiden given as a reward for valor, was more than mere property to Achilles. To him, it represented honor, recognition of his deeds, and the respect he believed he had earned through countless battles. When Agamemnon claimed her for himself, it was not only an affront to Achilles' pride, but a public challenge to his status as the Greeks' greatest warrior. In that moment, personal honor clashed with the demands of unity, and pride proved as potent a weapon as any spear. Fury consumed Achilles, his wrath burning hotter than any campfire. He confronted Agamemnon, words sharp as blades, demanding justice and respect. Yet the king remained unmoved, stubborn in his claim, and dismissive of the slight. The tension rippled through the camp as soldiers and officers sensed that a rupture had formed in the very heart of Greek leadership. Allies whispered anxiously, aware that this dispute could have consequences far greater than the insult itself. In a dramatic and decisive gesture, Achilles withdrew from the battle entirely. Stripping himself of armor and laying aside his spear, he refused to fight alongside the Greeks. His rage was both personal and principled. He would not risk his life for an army that denied his worth and insulted his honor. This withdrawal sent shockwaves through the Greek ranks, leaving the army without its most powerful champion, the man whose presence had often guaranteed victory in the most desperate engagements. The impact was immediate. Greek morale plummeted as news of Achilles' withdrawal spread. Soldiers who had relied on his skill for protection now faced the prospect of fighting the Trojans without their strongest ally. Commanders scrambled to adjust strategies, trying to compensate for the sudden absence of their most formidable warrior. For the first time, doubt and fear crept into a camp long accustomed to relying on Achilles' prowess. Meanwhile, the Trojans sensed opportunity. Reports of Achilles' absence reached Hector and the Trojan commanders, and their spirits soared. They recognized that without Achilles, the Greeks were vulnerable, and the balance of power on the battlefield had shifted. Preparations were made to exploit the weakness, and the morale of Troy swelled, knowing that their greatest enemy would not face them in the coming clashes. Despite his anger, Achilles' absence was not merely a retreat from battle, it was a statement. It declared that honor and respect were as essential to a warrior as strength or skill. In the Greek camp, whispers circulated about the fragility of leadership and the consequences of arrogance. Agamemnon's authority remained unchallenged by law, but in the hearts of the soldiers, a rift had formed, one that threatened unity at a time when unity was essential. The days without Achilles were filled with bitter clashes and mounting casualties. Greek soldiers fought valiantly, but each engagement underscored the void left by their absent champion. Skirmishes that might have ended decisively with Achilles' intervention now dragged on, costly and exhausting. Greek commanders realized that one man, no matter how furious, could shape the tide of war, and that the fragile interplay of pride, honor, and leadership had consequences far beyond personal grievances. Meanwhile, in quiet moments away from the battlefield, Achilles brooded. His mind churned with anger, grief, and pride, and yet he also understood the paradox of his withdrawal. By refusing to fight, he protected his own honor, but he also jeopardized the very people he had long defended. Each day without him brought reports of losses and near defeats, deepening the tension between his desire for respect and the responsibilities he bore as the Greeks' greatest warrior. Ultimately, the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles became one of the defining dramas of the Trojan War. It was a story not of swords or strategy, but of human pride, fragile egos, and the devastating consequences when leadership and personal honor collide. The Greeks learned that even the mightiest army could falter without unity, and that Achilles, whose wrath could shape destinies, was a force whose absence was felt as keenly as his presence had once inspired.
With Achilles absent, the battlefield shifted in favor of Troy, and a wave of confidence surged through Hector and his warriors. For years they had fought in the shadow of Greece's greatest champion, a warrior whose name alone inspired fear. Now, with that fear lifted, the Trojans sensed opportunity. The city's walls had been defended tirelessly, and now the energy of years of siege found release in a bold and aggressive push led by their greatest hero. Hector, son of Priam and the pride of Troy, commanded with unmatched authority. Every order he gave was precise, every movement of his forces calculated to exploit the weakness left by Achilles' withdrawal. He did not seek glory for himself. His eyes were fixed on the Greek lines, and his mind was consumed with strategy, coordination, and timing. Each spear thrust, each formation maneuvered, was designed to maximize pressure and drive the Greeks back toward their vulnerable ships. The first attacks came as lightning strikes, sudden and relentless. Trojan archers rained arrows down upon the Greek front lines, forcing soldiers to scramble behind shields and hastily formed barricades. The Greek formations wavered, their morale shaken by the absence of the man who had often turned the tide of battle with a single decisive charge. Trojans surged forward in coordinated waves, exploiting gaps and weaknesses that might have been closed with Achilles present. Greek leaders scrambled to respond. Agamemnon and Menelaus shouted orders, attempting to stabilize their forces, but confusion and fatigue slowed their efforts. Experienced commanders recognized the danger immediately. Hector's tactics were not reckless assaults, but disciplined, intelligent maneuvers designed to inflict maximum damage while minimizing risk to their own soldiers. For the first time, the Greeks faced an organized and relentless onslaught without their unyielding champion. Trojan morale soared with every successful advance. Soldiers cheered as they pushed the Greeks closer to the shoreline, each small victory reinforcing the belief that Troy could hold and perhaps even triumph. The sight of Hector at the forefront, spear in hand, shield raised, and armor gleaming, inspired his men. They fought with a unity and confidence that came from knowing their leader shared every risk, never asking of his soldiers what he would not do himself. As the Greek forces retreated, the chaos grew near their ships. Soldiers jostled for space, equipment was abandoned in haste, and the sound of clashing metal and shouting filled the air. Each step back toward the vessels was a reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Yet for the Trojans, the pressure of the moment only heightened their resolve. Victory, they realized, was within reach, and the absence of Achilles had opened a rare window that might not present itself again. By the end of the day, the Greeks were pressed dangerously close to their ships, their morale shaken, their formations frayed, and their confidence eroded. Hector's bold attacks had achieved what years of siege had only hinted at. He had turned the tide of battle, if only temporarily. The Trojans, fueled by courage, strategy, and the leadership of their greatest hero, celebrated their gains while remaining vigilant. The battlefield had shifted, and the war, once again, hung in delicate balance between triumph and disaster.
Patroclus, the close friend and companion of Achilles, watched with growing anguish as the Greek army faltered under the relentless pressure of Hector's assaults. Every retreat toward the ships, every fallen comrade weighed heavily on his heart. Though he lacked Achilles' godlike skill and fearsome reputation, Patroclus could not bear to see his countrymen and friends suffer while the Trojans pressed their advantage. The cries of the wounded and the fear on the faces of the soldiers stirred him to action. In the quiet moments before dawn, Patroclus wrestled with a mixture of fear and resolve. He knew the danger that awaited anyone who stepped onto the battlefield, yet the suffering of the Greeks ignited a determination stronger than his own apprehension. He resolved that if Achilles would not fight, then someone must act to bolster the faltering army. His mind returned to his friend, remembering their shared training, their battles together, and the trust Achilles had placed in him over the years. Patroclus's decision was not made lightly. He knew that simply rallying the troops from the safety of the camp would not suffice. Morale had to be inspired by deeds on the field. And so, in a moment of both courage and desperation, he donned the shining armor of Achilles, the very symbol of the Greek army's might. To the Trojans, the sight of Achilles' armor on the battlefield would be terrifying. To the Greeks, it would rekindle hope and determination. Stepping onto the blood-soaked plains, Patroclus felt the weight of expectation and the gravity of his choice. The armor, gleaming in the early light, was a double-edged sword. It provided protection and authority, but it also carried the burden of Achilles' reputation. Each movement he made was scrutinized by both friend and foe, and he knew that any misstep could turn admiration into disaster. Yet his resolve did not waver. The Greeks needed a hero, even if that hero could only temporarily assume the mantle of Achilles. As he advanced, Patroclus called out to the soldiers, urging them to hold the line and push forward. His voice, filled with determination and authority, carried across the battlefield. The Greek warriors, weary and battered, recognized the armor and believed for a fleeting moment that Achilles himself had returned to fight. A surge of renewed courage coursed through them, reinvigorating their spirits and stiffening their resolve against the relentless Trojan attacks. The Trojans, meanwhile, were momentarily deceived by the appearance of Achilles' armor. They hesitated, caught between fear and curiosity, unsure whether the legendary warrior had returned to turn the tide. This hesitation, brief but critical, gave the Greeks a vital advantage. Patroclus seized the moment, leading charges, rallying scattered troops, and striking where the Trojans had grown overconfident. His actions turned panic into order, chaos into coordinated counterattacks. Despite his success in inspiring the Greeks, Patroclus could not ignore the danger. Each engagement tested his skill and courage to their limits. Though he fought with valor, he was not Achilles. The Trojans, once they recognized the truth, would rally against him with even greater ferocity. Patroclus's bravery was matched by the stakes he faced, for every spear and arrow could be his last, and every battle carried the weight of the Greeks' survival on his shoulders. Word of Patroclus's presence on the battlefield spread quickly. Greek soldiers, emboldened, fought with renewed vigor, while Trojan warriors, initially deceived, began to recognize the courage of the man before them. Yet the name Achilles still loomed in their minds, and Patroclus used that aura to push the Greeks forward, striking at the Trojan lines with precision and inspiring his comrades to reclaim lost ground. His boldness temporarily reversed the tide, turning retreat into advance and giving the Greeks a hope they had nearly lost. In the midst of battle, Patroclus felt both exhilaration and fear. He saw friends fall, heard cries of anguish, and experienced the chaos of war firsthand, yet he pressed on. Each step, each thrust of his spear was guided by loyalty to Achilles, duty to the Greek army, and love for the men who looked to him for leadership. His courage became a beacon,
proving that heroism was not measured solely by legendary skill, but also by selflessness and determination in the face of overwhelming danger. Ultimately, Patroclus' intervention became a turning point, even if temporary. He inspired the Greeks to push back against Hector and the Trojan forces, rekindling hope where despair had grown. But beneath the victories lay the shadow of risk and tragedy, for stepping into Achilles' armor meant he assumed not only the mantle of heroism, but also the deadly attention of Troy's greatest warrior. His actions, driven by loyalty and compassion, set in motion a chain of events that would echo across the battlefield and shape the course of the war in ways no one could yet foresee.
Patroclus fought with a courage that seemed to surpass his mortal limits, inspiring the Greek army to push forward against the relentless Trojan assault. Each spear he thrust, each Trojan he felled, reminded his comrades that hope was not yet lost. For a time, the battlefield seemed to shift in favor of the Greeks, as the sight of Achilles' armor, though worn by Patroclus, struck fear into the hearts of Troy's warriors. The illusion held, and the Greeks pressed their advantage with renewed vigor. Yet as the day wore on, the shadows lengthened and exhaustion began to take its toll. Patroclus, though determined and steadfast, felt the weight of hours of relentless fighting. His muscles ached, his breath came in ragged gasps, and the din of battle, clashing weapons, cries of the fallen, and the roar of horses pounded in his ears. Still he pressed onward, knowing that the Greek army's morale depended on his presence, and that Hector, the son of Priam and Troy's greatest champion, would inevitably confront him. That confrontation came at last. Hector, towering and resolute, spotted the figure in Achilles' armor and charged with the authority of a man convinced of his destiny. He believed he faced the legendary warrior himself, unaware that the man before him was only Patroclus. The clash was violent and immediate, spears clashing with shields, armor ringing with thunderous impact. Soldiers from both sides fell silent for a moment, watching the duel that seemed to embody the fate of the war itself. Patroclus fought bravely, matching Hector's skill as best he could. Each maneuver was executed with precision, yet every strike carried the vulnerability of a mortal man facing a hero of legend. He parried and countered, bought time for his comrades, and struck when opportunity allowed, but the strength and experience of Hector were overwhelming. With every blow, Patroclus realized that courage alone might not be enough to overcome Troy's greatest warrior. Despite his valor, Patroclus was eventually outmatched. Hector's strikes were relentless, his spear finding gaps in Patroclus's defenses that only fatigue and overexertion had created. With a powerful thrust, Hector pierced through the armor and flesh, and Patroclus fell to the ground, wounded fatally. The battlefield seemed to pause in that instant, as both Greeks and Trojans recognized the gravity of the moment. The man they believed to be Achilles had fallen, or so they thought. Hector, convinced he had slain the mighty Achilles, stood over the fallen warrior with a mixture of triumph and grim satisfaction. To him, the Greek army's champion was dead, and Troy had achieved a monumental victory. He did not yet know the truth, that Patroclus, a brave but mortal man, had borne the armor in place of his friend. His triumph was thus based on a tragic misunderstanding, one that would ripple through the hearts of both armies in profound ways. Greek soldiers rushed to Patroclus' side, horrified to see the beloved warrior lying lifeless upon the field. Their grief was immediate and raw, a mixture of sorrow, fear, and disbelief.
They realized that the temporary advantage his courage had provided was now gone, and that the Greek army was once again vulnerable. The illusion of Achilles' presence had inspired hope, but now that hope teetered on the brink of despair. Meanwhile, the Trojans, still unaware of Patroclus's true identity, celebrated what they believed to be a monumental victory. Hector's name resounded across the battlefield, and their morale soared. Yet even in their triumph, there was an undercurrent of destiny at play. None of them realized that this act would provoke the wrath of Achilles and shift the tide of the war in ways far more devastating than the death of one warrior could suggest. The tragedy of Patroclus lay not only in his death, but in the misperception that surrounded it. He had stepped into Achilles' armor out of loyalty, bravery, and love for his comrades, and in doing so, he became a symbol of selfless heroism. His death was a cruel twist of fate, a reminder that even the noblest intentions could carry unbearable consequences in the chaos of war. Ultimately, the loss of Patroclus set in motion a chain of events that would define the remainder of the Trojan War. Achilles' grief and fury at his friend's death would become legendary, transforming the Greek army's struggle into a battle of vengeance and wrath. Patroclus's sacrifice, though ending in tragedy, demonstrated the profound impact of loyalty, courage, and the human heart amidst the machinery of war. His story would echo forever as one of heroism, sorrow, and the heavy price of honor.
When news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles, a storm of grief and rage erupted within him. The battlefield that had once been a distant concern now pierced his heart with unbearable pain. The loss of his closest friend, the one who had shared his training, his victories, and his deepest confidences, struck like a spear to the soul. For Achilles, the war was no longer about honor or strategy. It had become intensely personal, and nothing could soothe the fire of anger that consumed him. The Greek camp felt the tremor of his grief. Soldiers who had once drawn courage from his absence now sensed a different energy, a man transformed by sorrow into a force of unstoppable fury. Achilles' mourning was not silent or private. It radiated outward, a palpable tension that electrified the air. His comrades watched as he prepared himself for battle, the gleam of his armor reflecting both light and wrath, and understood that the battlefield would soon bear witness to the full weight of his vengeance. Achilles' anger was focused entirely on Hector, the prince of Troy and the killer of Patroclus. Every strategy, every tactic, and every movement of the Trojan forces became a target of his wrath. He no longer fought for the Greeks or for personal honor. He fought for justice, for retribution, and for the memory of his fallen friend. The desire to face Hector directly consumed him, overriding caution and tempering all other impulses. The war's outcome seemed secondary to the single burning goal of confronting Troy's champion. Before returning to the battlefield, Achilles invoked the gods, seeking strength and guidance for the vengeance that now dominated his mind. He donned his armor, radiant and fearsome, the very symbol of Greek might and terror. Each piece he fastened was a promise that Hector would pay for his deeds and that Patroclus's death would not be in vain. Soldiers who glimpsed him felt a mixture of awe and dread. The warrior they had relied upon before now returned, fueled by grief and wrath that made him nearly unstoppable. As Achilles strode onto the plains, the ground seemed to tremble beneath him. Trojan scouts and soldiers caught sight of his shining armor and recognized the legend returned. Fear rippled through the ranks. Tales of his past victories, amplified by the grief that now fueled him,
struck terror into all who faced him. Even Hector, who had fought countless battles and inspired unwavering loyalty, would feel the weight of a force shaped not only by skill, but by the unquenchable fire of vengeance. The Greek soldiers, in contrast, were reinvigorated. Seeing Achilles return lifted morale instantly, transforming despair into hope. They pressed forward with renewed courage, rallying behind the figure whose fury promised a turning of the tide. The absence that had weighed on them for weeks now vanished, replaced by the certainty that the Greeks' greatest warrior had returned and would fight with a personal, relentless intensity. Achilles' path to Hector was marked by destruction. Trojan soldiers who attempted to halt him fell swiftly, their resistance crushed beneath the precision and fury of his attacks. Each spear, each swing of his sword seemed guided by vengeance itself. The battlefield became a blur of motion and chaos, a storm of bronze, blood, and steel, with Achilles at the eye, unstoppable and focused entirely on his goal, Hector. When the two champions finally met, the confrontation was monumental. Hector, noble and skilled, faced a warrior whose grief had been transformed into raw, destructive power. The clash of their weapons echoed across the plain, a cacophony of destiny and fury. Achilles fought not only with physical skill, but with the weight of personal loss driving every strike, making him a force beyond mere mortal measure. The intensity of Achilles' pursuit left the Trojans reeling. Even the bravest warriors hesitated, unsure if any defense could withstand the vengeance of a man whose grief had become a weapon. Hector, realizing the unstoppable rage before him, was forced to confront not only Achilles' skill, but the raw, almost divine energy of his wrath. The battlefield itself seemed to tremble under the collision of these two forces, one fueled by loyalty and honor, the other by grief and retribution. In the end, Achilles' return was more than a battle. It was a reckoning. The death of Patroclus had reshaped the war, turning strategy into vengeance and turning a hero into a near mythical figure whose fury would leave an indelible mark on Troy. Grief and rage intertwined, and every step he took toward Hector was a declaration that the bonds of friendship and loyalty were stronger than any fear, and that vengeance, once awakened, was an unstoppable force.
Outside the towering gates of Troy, the air trembled with anticipation as Achilles finally confronted Hector. The plain between the Greek and Trojan armies had become a stage for destiny, the clash of two warriors whose names would echo through history. Soldiers on both sides held their breath, knowing that what unfolded here would determine the fate of thousands and shape the legacy of the war itself. Hector, the noble prince of Troy, stood firm with shield in hand, his armor gleaming in the sunlight. Years of defending his city and leading his people had honed him into a warrior of unmatched skill and bravery. Yet even he could not deny the dread that stirred in his heart as he faced Achilles, the man whose very presence on the battlefield had turned hope into despair for the Trojans. This was no ordinary duel. It was a confrontation of two forces fated to collide. Achilles advanced with deliberate, unstoppable force. Every step seemed to shake the earth, every movement radiating both skill and a wrath that had been forged by grief. His eyes, burning with fury for Patroclus's death, fixed on Hector as though nothing else existed in the world. The Greek soldiers behind him felt a surge of confidence, while the Trojans braced themselves, knowing that the hero before them embodied death incarnate. The duel began with a clash of spears and shields, the metallic ringing echoing across the plains like the roar of the gods themselves. Each strike was a test of strength, speed, and cunning. Hector blocked and parried with precision, matching the skill of the legendary Greek warrior blow for blow. Yet every move Achilles made carried the weight of a wrathful purpose, and the ground beneath Hector seemed to quake with the intensity of the encounter. Hector struck first with a powerful thrust, seeking to pierce Achilles' defense and turn the duel in Troy's favor. Achilles, anticipating every motion, countered with the agility of a panther, deflecting the spear and driving Hector back with a swift and calculated strike. Each man knew that a single misstep could be fatal, and yet neither wavered. The tension was electric, a deadly dance between skill, honor, and the inexorable pull of destiny. As the battle continued, the warriors circled each other, exchanging blows that tested the limits of human endurance. Hector's bravery shone through, but Achilles' rage fueled an almost supernatural precision. Every attack and counterattack told a story of strategy, experience, and the deeply personal stakes of this confrontation. Soldiers on both sides watched in awe and fear, knowing that they were witnessing a moment that would be immortalized in song and story. The duel was more than combat. It was a clash of ideals and fates. Hector fought to defend his city, his family, and his honor, embodying the spirit of Troy itself. Achilles, driven by grief and vengeance, fought not only for retribution, but for the memory of his fallen friend Patroclus. Each strike reflected these motives, each movement a testament to courage, loyalty, and the human heart tested under unimaginable pressure. Finally, after a grueling exchange, Achilles' fury and skill gained the upper hand. Hector stumbled, his defenses failing under the relentless assault. The weight of inevitability pressed down upon him, yet even in that moment, Hector faced his fate with dignity, his eyes meeting Achilles with a mixture of defiance and acceptance. This confrontation was not merely a battle of arms, but a collision of destiny itself, where mortal courage met unstoppable wrath. With a decisive strike, Achilles ended the duel, and Hector fell to the ground, mortally wounded. The battlefield fell silent, as both Greeks and Trojans recognized the magnitude of what had just occurred. The greatest warrior of Troy had been slain by the greatest warrior of Greece, and the consequences would reverberate through both armies and across the annals of history. Achilles' vengeance had been fulfilled, yet the cost, the grief, the loss, and the shadow of death lingered over all who witnessed it. In that moment, the duel became legend, a story of heroism, rage, and fate that would endure for generations. Achilles and Hector had met as equals in skill and courage, yet their motivations and circumstances shaped the outcome. Their confrontation was more than a battle. It was a defining episode of the Trojan War, a testament to the power of human emotion, loyalty, and the relentless march of destiny that binds hero to hero and life to death.
Achilles struck with unstoppable force, and Hector, Troy's greatest defender, fell before him. The clash of spears and shields ended in a single, decisive moment, and the battlefield grew eerily silent as the realization spread: the Prince of Troy lay dead. Soldiers on both sides froze, hearts pounding, as the enormity of the event sank in. Troy had lost its mightiest champion, and the Greeks had claimed a victory that would forever be remembered in song and story. The Greek soldiers, though weary from battle, erupted in cheers and cries of triumph. Achilles, still burning with grief and fury over Patroclus's death, stood over Hector's fallen form, his rage both satisfied and unending. Yet, even as the Greeks celebrated, they recognized the gravity of their victory. Hector's death was not merely a loss of a warrior, but a blow to the morale and spirit of Troy itself. The fall of a hero always leaves echoes beyond the battlefield. Within the walls of Troy, the news spread like wildfire. Mothers, children, and elders gathered in disbelief as messengers arrived, breathless and grim. Hector's absence was a void that could not be filled. He had been more than a soldier. He was a symbol of hope, courage, and protection for the city. Panic and despair crept into the hearts of the citizens, for the fortress that had seemed impenetrable now appeared vulnerable, and the future of Troy itself hung in doubt. King Priam, Hector's father, was struck by inconsolable grief. He had raised his son to be both a leader and a protector, and now that son lay lifeless, a victim of the Greek hero's wrath. Priam's sorrow echoed across the palace and streets alike, touching every citizen who had ever looked to Hector for guidance or reassurance. The loss was not only personal, but emblematic of the suffering Troy would endure in the days to come. The Trojan soldiers were equally devastated. Their greatest champion, who had led them through countless skirmishes and repelled the fiercest Greek assaults, was gone. Confidence waned, and doubt crept into even the bravest hearts. Where Hector had fought, strategized, and inspired unity, there was now uncertainty and fear. The battlefield would never feel the same without the presence of the prince who had embodied Troy's courage. Amid the grief, the Greek army recognized the strategic advantage Hector's death had delivered. Without Troy's strongest defender, the city's walls were vulnerable, its soldiers demoralized, and its leadership shaken. The tide of war had shifted decisively, and the Greeks understood that this victory could pave the way toward the ultimate conquest of Troy. Yet even amidst their triumph, there was acknowledgement of the gravity of taking a life so central to the enemy's identity. The citizens of Troy mourned collectively. From the humblest homes to the grandest halls, cries of sorrow filled the streets. Children who had idolized Hector wept openly, and mothers clutched their young, fearing what might come next. The city's morale had been shattered in a single blow, demonstrating that wars are not won only through weapons, but also by striking at the spirit and hope of the people. Even Achilles, though victorious, was not untouched by the human weight of death. He had killed Hector in fury and vengeance, yet the image of his fallen adversary remained vivid in his mind. The duel had been a culmination of rage and grief, but it also reminded him of the cost of war, the lives that hung in balance, and the consequences of personal vendettas carried into battle. Victory brought not only pride, but a solemn recognition of mortality and loss. In the aftermath, the Trojan people faced the chilling reality that their city's fate had shifted dramatically. Leaders scrambled to reorganize defenses, soldiers tried to rally around remaining commanders, and families clung to each other for comfort. The sense of security that Hector had embodied was gone, leaving a city vulnerable not just to attack,
but to despair. Troy's very identity as a proud and invincible city felt threatened for the first time. Hector's death became a turning point, both strategically and emotionally, in the Trojan War. The Greeks gained not only a tactical advantage, but also a psychological one, while Troy grappled with grief, fear, and the daunting challenge of defending a city whose greatest hero had fallen. In the hearts of both warriors and civilians alike, Hector's life and death became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the enduring tragedy of war that spares neither hero nor homeland.
In the quiet of night, when the battlefield had fallen silent and the Greek camp slept uneasily, King Priam of Troy undertook a journey few would dare. The death of his beloved son Hector weighed heavily on him, and grief drove him beyond fear and reason. Clad in simple garments rather than kingly robes, he slipped past the watchful eyes of the Greek sentries, guided only by sorrow and the desperate hope of reclaiming his son's body. The weight of Troy's loss pressed on Priam's shoulders as he approached Achilles' tent. Every step was a mixture of dread and determination, for he knew he faced the man who had slain his son. The sight of Hector's armor, gleaming even in the dim moonlight, haunted Priam, yet he pressed onward, driven by paternal love stronger than any fear of violence or insult. This was not a king acting for pride or strategy. It was a father seeking to honor the memory of his child. Inside the tent, Achilles was still awake, brooding over the death of Patroclus and the rage that had propelled him to slay Hector. His mind was consumed with vengeance, grief, and the relentless weight of battle. The sudden presence of an old man, frail yet dignified, at the edge of his tent startled him, yet the quiet authority of sorrow immediately commanded his attention. Here was a man who carried a different kind of power, the power of grief and humanity. Priam knelt before Achilles, laying aside fear in the face of unbearable loss. With trembling voice, he addressed the Greek warrior, not as an enemy, but as a fellow mourner who had the power to grant one final act of mercy. "Achilles," he said, "my son was your enemy in battle, but he was my son. Grant me the sacred right to bury him, so that Troy may mourn and honor his memory." The words were simple, yet carried the weight of generations and the depth of a father's love. For a long moment, Achilles remained silent, the rage within him clashing with something softer, almost forgotten in the storm of war: compassion. The grief etched into Priam's face mirrored his own loss over Patroclus. In that moment, Achilles glimpsed the universality of human suffering, that even enemies share the same bonds of love, loss, and loyalty. The battlefield, with its blood and fury, seemed to fade, leaving only two men, bound by grief, facing each other. Achilles felt a stirring of emotion he had not experienced since Patroclus's death. His anger, which had driven him to slaughter, softened as he recognized the courage and vulnerability in Priam's request. Here was a king who had set aside pride, honor, and fear to honor a son. Achilles realized that granting this request would not diminish his victory or his fury, but would affirm the humanity that even war could not destroy. Moved beyond words, Achilles spoke, his voice carrying both sorrow and respect. He assured Priam that Hector's body would be returned, that Troy would have the right to mourn and honor their greatest hero.
he himself would not stand in the way of this final act of dignity. In granting this mercy, Achilles acknowledged a shared truth that even amid the horrors of war, respect for life and grief transcend enmity. Priam's relief was profound, yet quiet. He bowed his head in gratitude, tears streaming freely. In that simple exchange, the old king reclaimed not just the body of his son, but a measure of honor and closure for himself and his people. The Greek soldiers who witnessed from afar understood that this moment was extraordinary, a rare instance of humanity breaking through the relentless cruelty of war. The act of returning Hector's body carried significance far beyond the battlefield. It allowed the Trojans to perform the sacred rites of mourning, to honor their hero with funeral games and lamentations that had been denied them in the heat of combat. Priam's courage, paired with Achilles' compassion, created a bridge between enemy and foe, demonstrating that even in a war defined by bloodshed, dignity and respect could endure. In the end, the encounter between Priam and Achilles became a timeless story of grief, courage, and shared humanity. Two men bound by love and loss transcended hatred and vengeance for a moment of profound compassion. The return of Hector's body symbolized that even amid the destruction of war, the bonds of family, respect, and honor remain unbroken, leaving a legacy that would be remembered long after the swords were sheathed and the battlefields emptied.
Despite the death of Hector, Troy's greatest champion, the war showed no sign of ending. The battlefield remained a scarred and bitter landscape where the clash of swords, the cries of the wounded, and the roar of war horses continued without pause. Both armies were exhausted, their strength tested to its limits, yet the stakes were too high for either side to yield. The Greeks had avenged Patroclus and slain Hector, but victory remained elusive, and the war dragged on, relentless and unforgiving. Troy, though devastated by the loss of their prince, refused to surrender. The city's walls still stood strong, and its remaining warriors rallied around leaders who could fill, at least temporarily, the void left by Hector. Each soldier fought not only for survival, but for the honor of their fallen hero. Mothers, fathers, and children watched from behind the walls, their hopes tied to the courage of those who remained. Every clash outside the city gates reminded them of both their vulnerability and their resilience. The Greek forces, while emboldened by Achilles' vengeance, also felt the toll of unending combat. Soldiers who had survived countless battles carried wounds both seen and unseen. Morale wavered in moments when victory seemed just out of reach, and the relentless strain of siege, exhaustion, and loss tested even the strongest warriors. For every Trojan they felled, the Greek army suffered casualties in return, and the death of Hector, though monumental, did not provide the decisive blow they had hoped for. Skirmishes and raids became a daily routine, as neither side could secure a permanent advantage. The Greeks launched relentless attacks on the Trojan walls, attempting to breach the city's defenses, while the Trojans countered with cunning sorties and ambushes that reminded their enemies of the cost of overconfidence. The war had transformed into a war of attrition, where endurance, strategy, and the ability to inspire troops became as crucial as the skill of individual champions. Leaders on both sides grew increasingly aware of the human cost. Families mourned the fallen, and fear began to mix with determination on both sides. Soldiers, some seasoned and others new to combat, faced the psychological strain of repeated loss and the constant threat of death. even as victories were won or setbacks endured, the shadow of mortality hung over every man, every horse, and every skirmish, making the war as much a battle of wills as of weapons. The absence of Hector created both gaps and opportunities. Other Trojan leaders emerged to defend their city, but none possessed the charisma or skill to fully match him. Yet their determination and familiarity with Troy's terrain allowed them to mount effective resistance, ensuring that the Greek army could never claim a decisive conquest. Similarly, the Greeks, despite Achilles' fearsome presence, realized that they could not simply overpower Troy through brute force alone. Patience, planning, and coordination remained essential. In the midst of this stalemate, minor heroes and leaders gained prominence. Soldiers who had been overshadowed by figures like Hector or Achilles stepped forward, taking on crucial roles in battles and raids. Each victory, each act of bravery contributed to a sense of hope and resilience on both sides. Yet these victories were often temporary, a reminder that the war's momentum could shift with a single strike or the loss of a key leader. The civilians of Troy bore the consequences of prolonged conflict. Supplies dwindled, famine threatened, and fear seeped into everyday life. Each day brought the distant thunder of battle, a reminder that the war was not confined to soldiers alone. Families hid, prayed, and mourned, their lives caught in the crossfire of events they could neither influence nor escape. Yet even in suffering, they clung to the hope that Troy's defenders could hold firm until fate turned in their favor. Similarly, the Greek soldiers faced their own hardships. Long campaigns, harsh conditions, and constant engagement with the enemy strained their bodies and minds. Leaders like Agamemnon struggled to maintain discipline and morale, knowing that the absence of decisive victories could weaken cohesion. Even with Achilles' unmatched skill, the army realized that wars are rarely won by a single hero. Collective effort, endurance, and strategy were essential for survival. Ultimately, the war became a test of endurance, patience, and resilience for both Troy and Greece. Neither side could claim complete victory, yet neither could be decisively defeated. Hector's death was a turning point, but it did not end the suffering or the conflict. The battlefield remained a place of courage and despair, hope and loss, a testament to the human cost of war and the enduring struggle between two civilizations locked in a seemingly endless contest for supremacy.
Achilles, the greatest warrior of Greece, had become a figure both feared and revered across the battlefield. His presence alone could turn the tide of any engagement, and for years he had been unstoppable, driven by grief, fury, and unmatched skill. Yet even the mightiest of heroes are not invincible, and fate, as ever, held a secret vulnerability that would determine his end. The war continued to rage around him, a storm of clashing shields, flaming arrows, and cries of the dying. Achilles led the Greeks with unyielding ferocity, cutting through Trojan forces as if propelled by divine wrath. Soldiers on both sides marveled at his strength and courage, unaware that a single, hidden weakness lay beneath the armor that made him nearly untouchable. Paris, the Prince of Troy, had long been overshadowed by Hector and the might of the Greek champions. Yet cunning and chance often shape destiny, and Paris carried with him an opportunity that would forever change the course of the war. Guided by his resolve and perhaps divine intervention, he prepared to strike at the one point where Achilles was mortal, the only flaw in his otherwise invincible form. In the chaos of battle, Paris loosed an arrow aimed at Achilles. The shaft flew swift and true, striking with unerring precision at the hero's heel, the single vulnerable spot that had been his hidden weakness since birth. It was a small wound in a vast and formidable body, yet it carried the weight of destiny. The arrow pierced the flesh, bypassing armor and strength, and inflicted a fatal blow that even Achilles' unparalleled skill could not survive. Achilles faltered for the first time in his legendary career. The mighty warrior, who had struck down countless foes without hesitation, stumbled and fell to the ground. His warriors and enemies alike froze, witnessing a moment that seemed impossible, the invincible Achilles brought low by a single arrow. The battlefield itself seemed to shudder in disbelief at the sudden vulnerability revealed in a man who had long been untouchable. Greek soldiers rushed to his side, their grief immediate and profound. The hero who had led them through years of grueling war, avenging Patroclus and shaping the course of battles with his unmatched prowess, was now mortal, struck down in a sudden and devastating blow. The loss was not only strategic, but deeply personal, shaking the morale of an army that had relied on his might as a beacon of hope. Trojans, too, reacted with a mixture of triumph and awe. Paris's arrow had accomplished what years of warfare could not. It had claimed the life of Greece's greatest warrior. Yet even in victory, the cost and weight of war remained evident. The battlefield was strewn with the dead and wounded, a testament to the human suffering that Achilles' death, while monumental, could not erase. Achilles' death became a moment of mythic significance, marking the turning of eras in the Trojan War. Stories spread of the hero felled by a single vulnerable point, and the legend of the Achilles' heel was born, a symbol of human imperfection, even in the greatest of warriors. The lesson endured. No matter how strong or skilled, mortality touches all, and fate reserves the final word. The Greek army mourned deeply, yet the war pressed on. Leaders sought to rally the troops, inspired by the memory of Achilles' courage and determination. His life and death became a rallying point, reminding soldiers of the sacrifices required in the pursuit of honor, vengeance, and survival. Achilles had been a symbol of wrath and heroism, and his absence left both a strategic and spiritual void in the Greek ranks. In the annals of history and legend, Achilles' death endured as a defining moment of the Trojan War. The hero who had slain Hector, avenged Patroclus, and turned the tides of countless battles was felled not by strength or skill, but by a single vulnerability.
With the deaths of legendary warriors like Hector and Achilles, the Trojan War had entered a grim and wearying phase. Both sides were exhausted, their forces thinned, and the morale of soldiers shaken. Each battle left more men fallen, each skirmish a reminder that even the mightiest heroes were mortal. The once glorious tales of individual heroism now gave way to a harsh reality. The war was grinding on, relentless and seemingly without end. The Greeks, despite their tactical victories, found themselves unable to breach Troy's massive walls or crush its defenders completely. The city, though weakened, remained fortified and well supplied, defended by soldiers who refused to yield even in the face of staggering losses. Every attempt at storming the gates or launching large-scale assaults met with fierce resistance, reminding the Greeks that brute force alone would not win the war.
Leaders like Agamemnon and Menelaus convened councils to discuss new approaches. With many of their greatest warriors dead, they realized that victory would require more than courage or individual prowess. It demanded ingenuity, patience, and cunning. The Greek commanders understood that Troy could not simply be taken by direct assault. The city had withstood years of siege, and the defenders' resolve remained unbroken. The soldiers themselves felt the weight of futility pressing upon them. Each day of battle brought fatigue, injuries, and dwindling supplies, and the absence of their heroes, Achilles among them, left a vacuum in leadership and morale. Yet, despite their weariness, the Greeks recognized the need to maintain unity and purpose. They began to look not towards single acts of heroism, but to collective strategies that could exploit the weaknesses of Troy over time. One of the key challenges was Troy's fortifications. Its walls, built to withstand years of attack, proved nearly impenetrable. Siege engines and battering rams caused damage only slowly, while every attempt to breach the gates was met with counterattacks and deadly resistance. Greek leaders realized that new tactics, ones that combined deception, patience, and cunning, would be necessary to overcome the city's defenses without further catastrophic losses. Strategists began to consider psychological warfare as well. They knew that Troy's soldiers and citizens were resilient, but morale could be undermined through clever ruses or sudden, unexpected actions. The Greeks contemplated methods to provoke confusion, create doubt, and manipulate the enemy into making mistakes. The realization dawned that victory might not come solely through combat, but through careful planning and ingenuity, tricking the defenders into leaving their strengths exposed. Meanwhile, the civilians of Troy continued to suffer the consequences of prolonged warfare. Food supplies were strained, fear and grief weighed heavily on families, and the constant threat of death loomed over every street. The Greek leaders understood that Troy's endurance was not limitless, yet the city's resilience was remarkable. They knew that defeating Troy required more than physical strength. It required patience and the ability to outthink a population determined to survive. The Greek army also reflected on the loss of their own heroes. Each fallen champion had once inspired not only fear in the enemy, but courage in their comrades. With that inspiration gone, leadership had to be decentralized, and every soldier was called upon to contribute to strategy and execution. The war had shifted from individual heroics to a test of collective will, resourcefulness, and endurance. Plans began to emerge that combined cunning and subtlety with brute force. The Greeks considered decoys, ambushes, and other tactics designed to exploit Trojan psychology. It became clear that a direct confrontation would not suffice. Victory required patience, deception, and calculated risk. The army began to shift its mindset from the glory of individual combat to the strategy of an entire campaign, understanding that only unity and ingenuity could break the city's defenses. In the end, the endless war became as much a test of mind as of arms. The Greeks learned that with many heroes gone, success relied not on the strength of one warrior, but on the ingenuity of the whole army. Each decision, each tactic, and each act of patience could determine the fate of the war. Troy, for its part, remained a fortress of courage and resilience, ensuring that the final chapters of this legendary conflict would be written not by brute force alone, but by cleverness, endurance, and the unyielding human spirit.
Amid the weary Greek commanders who had grown frustrated by the endless stalemate, Odysseus stood out for his sharp mind and cunning. Unlike the others, he understood that brute force alone would not topple Troy. The city had withstood years of assault, and its walls, defenses, and determined soldiers made direct conquest nearly impossible. He began to consider a strategy that would exploit not strength, but deception, turning the Trojans' confidence against them. Gathered around the war council, Odysseus proposed an unusual plan, one that startled many of his peers. Instead of another frontal attack, he suggested a ruse, an act so unexpected that it would bypass the city's defenses entirely. He described a large wooden horse, hollowed to conceal soldiers, which could be left outside Troy as a supposed offering to the gods. The Trojans, he reasoned, would be tempted to bring it within their walls, unaware of the deadly trap concealed inside. At first, the proposal met skepticism. The Greek commanders were accustomed to valor and force, not trickery, and many feared the plan was too risky or dishonorable. Agamemnon questioned whether such deception would achieve anything, while others worried it might fail and further demoralize the army. Yet Odysseus's reputation for cleverness and foresight lent credibility to his idea, and slowly curiosity replaced doubt. Odysseus explained the psychology behind the plan. Troy had survived countless sieges, and the defenders were both proud and cautious. A gift, appearing as a symbol of surrender or appeasement, could exploit their desires for victory and recognition of divine favor. By presenting the horse as a monument rather than a weapon, the Greeks could manipulate Trojan assumptions, creating an opening that no army could force through brute strength alone. As the council deliberated, Odysseus detailed the construction of the horse. It would be massive, tall enough to inspire awe, yet hollowed to conceal select soldiers of Greece's finest. Every plank, every carving was to appear ceremonial, a tribute to Athena, who the Trojans believed had protected their city. Soldiers would be chosen for their stealth, bravery, and discipline, capable of emerging from the horse under cover of night and opening the gates for the rest of the army. The Greeks recognized that success would depend not only on the construction of the horse, but also on the performance of the rest of the army. They needed to convince the Trojans that they had abandoned the siege in defeat, leaving the horse as a gesture of submission. Decoys, false retreats, and signals would be necessary to maintain the illusion. Odysseus's plan required patience, discipline, and faith in deception rather than force, a stark departure from the usual tactics of war. Trojan spies, unaware of the true nature of the horse, would report back its impressive size and apparent sacred purpose. Odysseus predicted that pride and curiosity would cloud judgment, tempting the Trojans to bring the gift within their walls. The plan relied on human nature itself, the desire for glory, the faith in divine favor, and the inability to resist a prize that seemed both beautiful and holy. It was a gamble that no sword could achieve on its own. As the Greeks began to construct the massive wooden horse, excitement and tension coexisted among the soldiers. Some were nervous about the audacity of the plan, while others marveled at its ingenuity. Each plank hammered, each carving shaped, represented not just craftsmanship, but a step toward ending a war that had lasted a decade. The horse became both a symbol of cleverness and a testament to the Greeks' adaptability in the face of frustration and failure. Odysseus personally oversaw the selection of the soldiers who would hide inside the horse. Only the most disciplined and courageous men were chosen, for the plan demanded stealth, endurance, and the ability to act under extreme pressure. Each soldier understood the danger. Discovery could mean certain death, yet the reward, Ending the war and claiming Troy was a prize worth the risk. The success of the plan rested entirely on their skill and courage, matched by Odysseus's foresight. Ultimately, Odysseus's proposal marked a turning point in the Greek approach to the war. For years, battle and heroics had dominated their strategy, yet now cleverness and psychological manipulation became the key to victory. The plan promised not just the end of the war, but a lesson in the power of intellect and strategy over brute force. It demonstrated that even the strongest city, defended by the bravest warriors, could be undone by wit, patience, and the careful exploitation of human pride. The Greeks set to work with determination, their hands and tools shaping a massive wooden horse unlike anything Troy had ever seen. Carpenters and craftsmen labored day and night, building the enormous structure with hollow chambers large enough to conceal dozens of soldiers. Every detail was carefully designed to give the impression of a sacred offering to Athena, the goddess who the Trojans believed could protect their city. It was both a feat of engineering and a weapon of cunning, a masterpiece intended to deceive as much as to intimidate. Inside the horse, the chosen Greek soldiers waited in silence, their armor stripped to allow them to fit, their weapons concealed and ready. Each man knew the risk. Discovery would mean instant death, while success would allow them to deliver Troy into Greek hands. They communicated in whispers, checking their gear and steadying their nerves, aware that their fate and the fate of the war rested on their discipline, courage, and secrecy. The tension inside the horse was nearly unbearable, as every creak of wood or distant sound of the city could signal the end. The Trojans stood in awe as they approached the massive wooden horse at the gates of their city. Its size was astonishing, towering over the soldiers and citizens alike, and its craftsmanship suggested both reverence and divine blessing. Many believed it to be an offering to Athena, a symbol of Greek surrender and a token of victory for Troy. Pride and hope coursed through their hearts, temporarily blinding them to caution. Leaders and elders debated the horse's purpose. Some argued that it was a cunning trap, warning against bringing it inside the walls, while others saw it as a gift from the defeated Greeks, a sacred tribute to the gods. Exhaustion, desperation for an end to the long war, and the desire for triumph ultimately tipped the scales. The majority chose to see it as a symbol of victory, a tangible sign that Troy had survived and the Greeks had finally retreated. The citizens of Troy poured into the streets to witness the spectacle. Soldiers, merchants, and even children marveled at the enormity of the horse. Its polished sides gleamed in the sunlight, and intricate carvings depicted scenes of worship and battle. The Trojans whispered about the honor it must bring to their city, believing that they had outlasted their enemies. Pride and jubilation filled the air, giving the people a rare moment of relief after years of siege and suffering. With great effort, the Trojans began dragging the horse through the city gates. Strong men coordinated ropes and pulleys, and the clatter of wooden wheels echoed through the streets. The citizens cheered, seeing their combined strength successfully move the massive structure. Each step further inside the walls strengthened their belief that Troy had survived and that the Greeks had conceded defeat, leaving behind a gift of peace and honor. Inside the city, priests and elders performed prayers and rituals, invoking Athena's blessing over the horse. They interpreted the offering as a divine favor, a symbol that the gods themselves acknowledged Troy's endurance and valor.
music, and chants accompanied the horse's movement, as if the entire city were participating in a celebration of triumph over adversity. The atmosphere was one of victory, hope, and festivity, masking the imminent danger concealed within the massive wooden figure. Despite the festive mood, a few wary voices expressed doubt. Some citizens questioned why the Greeks would leave such a magnificent horse without reason. Others feared that cunning might be hidden beneath the grandeur, a final attempt at revenge. Yet these cautious murmurs were few, easily drowned by the cheers of the majority. Hubris, excitement, and relief had overtaken prudence, making the city vulnerable to the clever deception of their enemies. As the horse was positioned in the central square, curiosity and pride mingled in the hearts of the Trojans. They circled the structure, marveling at its craftsmanship and speculating about its purpose. Children climbed nearby walls to catch a better view, while adults debated its significance. For the moment, the wooden horse was a symbol of ultimate victory, an emblem of endurance after a decade of relentless war. Night began to fall, and the celebrations continued. Fires illuminated the streets, casting dancing shadows that made the horse seem even larger and more imposing. Music and laughter echoed across the city, while inside the wooden hollow, Greek soldiers lay in tense silence. Every cheer, every drumbeat heightened the suspense for those hidden within, while the Trojans remained blissfully unaware of the deadly secret they had welcomed into their midst. The irony of the scene was stark. Troy, proud and confident, had invited the seeds of its own destruction into the heart of the city. What they believed to be the ultimate symbol of victory was in truth the harbinger of their downfall. The contrast between celebration and impending doom created a tension that neither the citizens nor the soldiers could comprehend, making the moment both triumphant and tragically ironic. By the time the city finally quieted and its inhabitants retired to their homes, the Greek soldiers remained poised, ready to strike. The wooden horse, celebrated as a monument to Trojan ingenuity and endurance, had become a silent instrument of destruction. Troy's fate, once thought secure in the apparent retreat of the Greeks, now hung precariously on the brink of catastrophe, waiting for darkness to reveal the deadly truth concealed within the horse.
As darkness cloaked Troy, the city's streets echoed with the sounds of celebration. Fires flickered along the walls, casting long, dancing shadows over the massive wooden horse that now stood in the central square. Citizens laughed, drank, and feasted, believing the war finally at an end. The Trojans' pride and relief were palpable, their joy blinding them to the deadly secret waiting silently at the heart of their city. Inside the hollow horse, the Greek soldiers waited in tense silence. Every man's heart pounded in unison, their breathing measured to avoid detection. The hollow wooden walls creaked faintly under their weight, a subtle reminder that one wrong movement could betray their presence. Months of planning, years of conflict, and countless lives now hinged on their ability to emerge at the precise moment without alerting the city's defenders. Odysseus, crouched near the entrance of the horse, gave the silent signal. The soldiers moved with careful precision, their steps slow and deliberate. The first few emerged into the shadows of the square, weapons drawn but concealed until the proper moment. The city, consumed by revelry, did not notice the subtle movement of these figures, mistaking the occasional glint of metal for the flicker of torchlight. As more Greeks emerged, a tense rhythm took hold.
Each soldier found a position near the gates or key points in the city, ready to strike when the order came. Their presence was silent and deadly, their discipline absolute. The moment required both patience and courage, for exposure too early would mean certain death, and hesitation could compromise the entire plan. Every sense was heightened. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, thick with suspense. The unsuspecting Trojans continued their celebrations, oblivious to the danger at their feet. Families laughed, children ran through the streets, and soldiers drank and boasted, believing that the Greeks had finally admitted defeat. The contrast between their joy and the deadly purpose of the hidden Greeks created a tension so stark it was almost tangible, as if the night itself held its breath in anticipation. Finally, when the city was fully lulled into a false sense of security, Odysseus gave the signal for action. The Greek soldiers spread silently through the streets, moving toward the gates and critical points of defense. Every step was calculated, every movement executed with precision. The once celebratory city square now became the stage for a silent, impending nightmare that the Trojans could neither see nor imagine. The Greeks approached the gates, where the city's defenders had grown relaxed after years of siege and exhaustion. With swift, practiced movements, they neutralized the few guards still alert, ensuring that the rest of the army could enter without immediate resistance. The combination of stealth, timing, and surprise gave the Greeks a decisive advantage, turning what had seemed like a harmless celebration into a doorway for conquest. Once the gates were opened, the Greek forces hidden nearby surged into the city. The initial shock overwhelmed the Trojans, who had been celebrating in confidence and joy. Panic spread like wildfire. Guards sounded alarms too late, and the streets erupted into chaos. The Greeks, emerging first from the horse and now reinforced by the main army, struck with precision, exploiting confusion and fear to devastating effect. In the chaos, the wooden horse itself became a symbol of the Greeks' cunning. The citizens who had once marveled at its grandeur now saw it as a vessel of doom. The Greeks inside moved swiftly, spreading through the streets and ensuring that the city's leaders could not organize a coherent defense. The long years of siege, the deaths of heroes, and the pride of the Trojans all culminated in this moment, when cleverness triumphed over brute strength.
The Greek soldiers, having emerged silently from the wooden horse, quickly moved to the city gates. Each step was calculated, every movement precise, as the fate of Troy now rested on their skill and discipline. The guards stationed at the walls had grown complacent, lulled by the long siege and the apparent retreat of the Greeks. In a matter of moments, this complacency would become their undoing. With careful coordination, the hidden soldiers neutralized the few watchmen still alert. There was no loud clash, no drawn-out struggle, just swift, efficient actions that left the gate unguarded. The city's defenders, caught off guard by the precision of the Greeks, could barely react. The key to success had always been surprise, and now, after years of patience and planning, the Greeks had it in full force. Odysseus and his men worked quickly, unlatching the massive gates and ensuring that the path into the city was clear. The enormous wooden horse loomed nearby, a silent reminder of the cleverness that had brought them this far. Every sound of movement within the city streets now carried a heightened sense of danger,
as the Trojans remained blissfully unaware of the forces mobilizing in their midst. Outside the walls, the rest of the Greek army waited under cover of darkness. Ships hidden along the shore and men concealed in nearby hills now surged forward the moment the gates were opened. The city that had resisted siege after siege for 10 years was about to face the ultimate breach, not through strength alone, but through cunning and strategy. The Greeks had turned patience, deception, and precision into a weapon more powerful than any army could wield. The gates swung wide, and the Greek soldiers moved in first, flowing silently through the streets. Their sudden presence caused immediate panic among the Trojans, who were still celebrating their supposed victory. Guards shouted in confusion, citizens screamed in fear, and the sound of swords clashing echoed through the narrow alleys. Chaos erupted almost instantly, leaving the city vulnerable at every corner. As the Greeks poured into Troy, their discipline allowed them to quickly seize key positions. Towers, gates, and command points fell into their hands before the Trojans could organize a coherent defense. The initial shock paralyzed the city, and the Trojans found themselves fighting an enemy that had already anticipated every move. What had seemed like celebration and triumph quickly became terror and desperation. The returning Greek army moved with terrifying efficiency. Soldiers who had waited patiently for this moment now flooded the streets, overwhelming the defenders with sheer numbers and coordination. The combination of surprise and precision meant that even the bravest Trojans could not mount an effective counterattack. In a matter of hours, the Greeks had turned a once celebrated city square into a battlefield of panic and bloodshed. Amid the chaos, the citizens of Troy tried to flee, but narrow streets and locked gates trapped many. Families clutched one another, searching for safety, while soldiers desperately tried to defend their homes. The city that had seemed so secure behind its massive walls was now at the mercy of the very army it had once resisted. Every step the Greeks took was calculated to ensure that the city could not recover from the shock of the breach. By dawn, the situation had become catastrophic for Troy. Leaders were either dead or trapped. The streets were filled with fleeing civilians, and the once proud city had been turned into a scene of terror and desperation. The Greeks, having opened the gates through careful planning and execution, had achieved what years of siege and battle could not: total control of Troy from within. The opening of the gates became the defining moment of the Trojan War. What had begun as a clever ruse with a massive wooden horse had culminated in the collapse of a city that had stood for generations. The Greeks' patience, ingenuity, and strategic brilliance allowed them to achieve what sheer force had failed to accomplish, marking the end of Troy's legendary resistance and cementing the story of the war in history and myth alike.
Once the gates were opened, the Greeks surged into Troy with unstoppable force. Soldiers moved swiftly through the streets, cutting down those who resisted and securing strategic points across the city. Panic spread like wildfire among the citizens who had believed the war was over only hours before. The celebration that had filled the streets now turned to screams of terror as the realization of betrayal sank in. Flames erupted throughout the city, ignited by torches wielded by the Greek soldiers. Wooden homes and buildings, stacked tightly along narrow streets, quickly caught fire, spreading chaos and destruction.
Though the city of Troy lay in ruins, its story refused to fade. The walls had crumbled, the palaces had burned, and the lives of countless citizens had been lost, yet the memory of the Trojan War endured. It was preserved not in stone or brick, but in the hearts, voices, and pens of those who lived to recount the tale, ensuring that the legacy of both heroism and tragedy would survive the ravages of time. Poets and storytellers immortalized the war through verse and song. Bards recounted the bravery of Hector defending his city, the rage of Achilles avenging Patroclus, and the cleverness of Odysseus with his wooden horse. These tales transformed human struggle into legend, blending history with imagination and capturing the emotions, fears, and aspirations of an entire age. Through rhythm and rhyme, the horrors and glories of Troy reached ears far beyond its fallen walls. The Trojan War also became a canvas for exploring timeless human themes. Pride and hubris, both of kings and ordinary citizens, shaped decisions that determined the fate of entire armies. The love and jealousy surrounding Helen ignited a conflict that consumed generations. Ambition and honor drove men to acts of bravery and cruelty alike. By examining these motivations, storytellers created a mirror for audiences to reflect on their own desires and flaws. Historians and chroniclers sought to preserve Troy's story for future generations. While the exact details of the war often varied, its significance remained clear. A city, a people, and a culture could rise to greatness and yet fall in an instant when human nature and circumstance intertwined. The deeds of heroes, the cunning of strategists, and the suffering of innocents were meticulously recorded, ensuring that the lessons of Troy would not be forgotten. Artists, too, captured the war's enduring legacy. Pottery, murals, and sculptures depicted scenes from the siege, the battles, and the moments of heroism and betrayal. These images brought the story to life for those who could not hear the poems or read the histories, reinforcing the idea that Troy's fate was both a cautionary tale and a celebration of human ingenuity, courage, and tragedy. The legend of Troy transcended borders and cultures. Greek, Roman, and later European civilizations retold the story, adapting it to their own values and sensibilities. Through translation, adaptation, and reinterpretation, the Trojan War became not just a Greek tale, but a universal story about the human condition, demonstrating how love, ambition, and pride can shape history on a grand scale. Philosophers and scholars reflected on the war's moral and ethical lessons. They debated the consequences of rage, the duties of rulers, and the costs of vengeance. Hector's nobility, Achilles' fury, and Odysseus' cunning provided enduring examples of virtue, flaw, and intellect. The story of Troy became a tool to explore morality, leadership, and human behavior, making it a source of wisdom as well as entertainment. Even in modern times, the Trojan War resonates. Its characters and events appear in novels, films, plays, and educational texts, connecting contemporary audiences to the world of ancient Greece. Themes of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of pride continue to captivate, proving that Troy's story is not merely an ancient myth, but a timeless exploration of humanity. The endurance of Troy's story also reflects the human fascination with epic struggle. People are drawn to tales of monumental conflicts where ordinary lives intersect with extraordinary events.
The war, its heroes, and its tragedies illustrate both the heights of human courage and the depths of human folly, reminding generations that history is shaped not only by might, but by choices, emotions, and the consequences they bring. Ultimately, though the city itself was lost, the Trojan War became immortal, passed down through generations in poems, legends, art, and scholarly works. The Trojan War reminds humanity of the power of storytelling. Troy's legacy is a testament to the endurance of memory, the resonance of heroism and tragedy, and the enduring lesson that pride, love, and ambition, forces as ancient as civilization itself, can shape the destiny of nations.